Hello, my name is the Professor, and I'm here today to show you my guide to happy poetry. There we are, the Professor's Guide to Happy Poetry. Now then, I'm not very used to this gizmo here, but I have watched a few YouTube and TikTok videos, and I know what it's all about. Basically, you can get away with a lot of things if you just do loads and loads of really fast cuts. Ta-da! That make you feel a bit seasick. Yes, right, yes. So I've mastered that, I think. But I'm here to talk to you about poetry. Now, I do a bit of poetry. I do quite a lot of things, actually. I do poetry, I do trigonometry, I do macrame, a spot of whitewater rafting. But today, I'm here to talk to you about poetry, and specifically happy poetry. Poetry about things that make you happy. So, my first poetry tip is how I describe poetry. I describe poetry as a bit like orange squash. Yes. Now, by that, I don't mean if you spill it, it makes a sticky mess. No, you can't really spill poetry because it's not a liquid, and well, we won't even go there. Right. So it's like orange squash, because if you taste orange squash by itself, it's concentrated. It's concentrated. What you need to do with orange squash is add some water. Oh yes. Break it down, dilute it, make it a bit more palatable. And poetry is just like that. Not concentrated oranges. No. Concentrated language. All the language has been squeezed into a small space because it's been concentrated. And my second poetry tip comes from a friend of mine, a proper poet called Jo. Now, she always says this about poetry. I'm going to show you a bit of poetry and a bit of prose, which is your normal story writing. You might recognise the chap in these pictures. Now, can you see in the poetry book? Okay, there's some poetry, right? And here, in one of my favourite books, is some prose. Now, this is normal writing, normal storytelling writing that isn't poetry, right? Can you see that? Fills up the page, doesn't it? Fills up the page with writing. The poetry, on the other hand, look at all this. Look at all this space. All this space around the poetry. Now, do you know what's made that space? That space around the poetry has been made by all the words that the poet has left out. Oh yes, it's concentrated. You see, it's like the orange squash. Another tip. This is from another poetry friend of mine called Johnny. He writes poems mainly about coffee. Poems about coffee, not orange squash, coffee. But Johnny says that poems are words on holiday. Oh yes, words that have been let out of work, let out of school, they've got a week off, and they're going to have as much fun as they possibly can. So I'm going to write a poem now. A very simple type of poem called a limerick. I like limericks. Limericks always have 5, count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines. Now, I like writing poems about different people, and I always ask them what's their name first up, because normally the first line of a limerick will go a little bit like this. And I'm writing this as I say it, so bear with me. A young man we know as the Professor. Yes, yes, I know. Now, that's where you could put your name in. If you're writing a limerick, that's where you could put your name in. If your name is Sam, you could say, there once was a young man called Sam. If your name is Veronica, you could say, a young girl we knew as Veronica. So I've got my first line. A young man we know as the Professor. And I'm going to think of something now that rhymes with Professor. Snappy dresser, should we go for that? It's the obvious one, isn't it? A young man we know as the Professor was always quite the snappy dresser. Oh yes. Now this is where I'm going to put in what I like doing. These are the things that make me happy. He liked knit, wear, crafting, and white water rafting. Oh. And researching Edward the Confessor. A young man we know as the Professor was always quite the snappy dresser. He liked knitwear crafting and whitewater rafting and researching Edward the Confessor. There, that's a poem all about what makes me happy. And you can do the same. Use your own name and think about things that you like doing. It could be swimming, it could be gymnastics, it could be eating pizzas. So that has been my guide to happy poetry. I hope you enjoyed it. See you later.
I wish they all could be California girls. La 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 la. La 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 la.